Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. My name is Anne, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled Moving from Form to Function for Strengthening Climate Policy and Governance in Economic Sectors. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we would like to let you know that this meeting will be recorded for documentation purposes. Furthermore, your participation using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen is highly encouraged, so feel free to share any perspectives or provide any inputs. And please feel free to reach out to me using the chat box if you need any technical assistance as well. To those of you who are joining us, welcome. We are in the session titled Moving from Form to Function for Strengthening Climate Policy and Governance in Economic Sectors. Finally, I wanted to note that one of our speakers will be speaking in Marathi today, and the closed captioning will be available for that. There will be someone who will be typing closed captions in English while that speaker is speaking. And if the closed captions do not appear for you, please feel free to click the CC button at the bottom of your screen to make sure that they are enabled. Okay, with that, I think we are ready to get started. I will now pass the floor to Cristina Rumbitis del Rio, Action Track Co-Manager of the Global Commission on Adaptation at the World Resources Institute. Cristina, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm joining you here from the UK. Good afternoon for some of you, and perhaps even good evening. It's really great to be here together for this session on climate policy and governance at APAN. Please do take a moment to drop your name in the chat box. We'll have a moment to get to know each other a little bit better in a second. But we have a dynamic session graciously organized by the government of the Maldives, focusing on the role of policy and governance in fostering economic resilience. With the COVID-19 crisis, I think we're all witnessing economic resilience in real time, where it's working and where it's failing. Hopefully we're all paying attention to who it's benefiting and who it's leaving behind. But what is also sometimes a bit hidden is what are the enabling factors that support that economic sector resilience, the infrastructure and policies, the institutions, the incentives, the evidence base and awareness that are out there. And so today we're going to be diving deeper into these factors through a climate lens. Hearing from grassroots representatives, government representatives, intermediaries working at various scales across Asia Pacific to ensure that as we adapt to climate change, we are building in the enablers of long-term economic resilience. So please do join us and participate. We want to start off with a little bit of a poll to learn more about you, to tell us who you are. So if you wouldn't mind bringing up the first poll. Tell us where you're coming from, what sector, government, NGO, freelancer, international organization, grassroots organization, think tank. Tell us where you are. Just click an option there and click submit. We'll see the results in just a second. One of the great things about APAN that I always love is just meeting such a cross sector of people working on adaptation just from across the board. Can we see the results of that first poll, please?
Results are shared.
Ah, so we have lots of international organizations joining. Excellent. Some think tanks, some grassroots, some freelancers, government as well, NGO. That's great. Great, good representation. Let's bring up the second section, second question. This is about sectors and which sectors have you worked in? Just to give us an example, and you can click more than one. So take a second to fill that out. Because one of the things we'll be noting in today's session is that really there's many different sectors that need to be engaged. and work across, but they all do interrelate at the end of the day. So let's see what the results tell us. Lots of others, interesting. And then a good spread between agriculture, SMEs, a little bit less on tourism and trade, and then all sorts of others. Great. That's good to know. As I said, please do take the time to put your name in the chat box. Tell us where you're joining from. Tell us your name. It's just a chance to get to know each other better, even though we're in an online format. It still is a good opportunity to connect. Next, we'll have some brief opening remarks from Mr. Ahmed Waheed, who is the Director of Climate Change in the Director of the Climate Change Department in the Ministry of Environment of the Maldives. His main tasks include resilience and adaptation planning, and he contributes to formulating and mobilizing resources to implement nationwide resilience building initiatives and programs. He has more than 7 years of experience in the climate change sector, having participated in the climate negotiations as a member of the Maldives national team. He's also worked to help formulate various policy instruments, such as the National Climate Change Policy Framework, the Draft Climate Change Bill, and engaged with communications for the UNFCCC process, such as the nationally determined contributions and national communications. Prior to joining the Climate Change Department, Mr. Waheed served as the Water and Environmental Health sections of the ministry. He holds a bachelor's degree in science and a master's degree in science and sustainability, environment, and change. Mr. Waheed, the floor is yours.
Christina, distinguished panelists, participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon to you all. At the outset, let me take this opportunity to express my sincere appreciation to the organizers for conducting this important forum in this very challenging time. I would also like to thank the organizers for the opportunity. Indeed, it's an honor for us, the Ministry of Environment of the Maldives, to be one of the partners of this event. Climate change is the most challenging issue facing the world today. We all are already experiencing the effects. But small island nations like the Maldives are particularly at risk and faces unique challenges in addressing the climate change impacts. The physical, economic, and other vulnerabilities further exacerbate our coping capacity and slows the hurt on development gains we have achieved in terms of sustainable development goals. Ladies and gentlemen, today it is evident that there is a strong link between climate risks and sustainable economic growth. For example, in case of the Maldives, the main economic sectors such as tourism and fisheries will face severe implications due to climate change. Increasing frequency and magnitude of extreme events, coastal erosion, impacts on biodiversity, coral bleaching, and fish migration will have high risks on the GDP, affecting investments and income earning opportunities for many people. Ladies and gentlemen, as many countries are exposed to natural and economic shocks beyond our domestic control, and vulnerability to external shocks remains one of the main development challenges facing many of us today. The ongoing COVID pandemic clearly demonstrates our case. The global crisis is hitting us hard. It has manifested our severe vulnerability to economic shocks. For example, the World Trade Organization estimated that total merchandise trade volume would decline by 9.2% approximately in 2020 because of the COVID pandemic. The decline in severe trade was exacerbated by restrictions on travel with a catastrophic effect on international tourism. In our case, the Maldives, which depends mainly on tourism, this will impact our tourism and undermine our main sources of income. And becoming one of the hardest hits from the COVID pandemic. Therefore, while increasing our efforts on resilience building, it's important to consider a multifaceted approach, ranging from climate adaptation to economic diversification. And we can learn from best practices from each other towards accelerating our economic resilience building works. Countries also need to invest on diversifying their economies to reduce the vulnerabilities. This will create more opportunities, especially for vulnerable groups and communities. For example, one important lesson we have learned from the COVID-19 is the fragility of our food system. Through policy interventions and creating enabling environments, there is a huge potential that food production will not only increase the resilience, but it will also create more economic opportunities for employment and create improvements in labor productivity. The huge potential behind blue economy is still fully untapped. It will further help us to increase our resilience while creating enormous opportunities for communities and societies. So what can be done? Building synergies with climate risk reduction and economic development, mainstream resilience building actions into sustainable economic development initiatives are options that can be considered seriously. In addition, formulating and implementing economic development policies, strategies that fits into resilience building purposes is needed. A holistic participatory approaches on enhanced planning processes at different levels would be utmost important. While accelerating our climate actions, we would also need to consider climate proofing of our investments, infrastructure, and services. In addition to this, capacity building and institutional strengthening are also key to success. Let's work together to accelerate the climate actions while building back better for a sustainable and resilient recovery. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Wahid, for those great opening remarks, which really help set the stage for the issues that we'll be discussing today. Without further ado, I want to turn to our first panel. We'll have 4 different speakers that are focusing on different perspectives on economic sector resilience. We'll hear from a grassroots community member who will be speaking in Marathi. And so we'll encourage people to turn on the closed captioning for that, so you can see the remarks in English. We'll also be hearing about government perspectives, mountain entrepreneurship, infrastructure for delivery of economic services, and engaging the private sector in agriculture and resilience from a governance perspective. So without further ado, I want to turn to Shailaja Narwadi, who is a grassroots community member from Swayam Fiction Prayog, SSP, an NGO in India. And as I mentioned, she'll be speaking in Marathi. So please turn on the closed captioning. Hopefully you all see a link to do that. Shailaji, the floor is yours.
नमस्कार, माझे नाव आहे शैलजा श्रीकांत नरवडे, राहणार मसलात खुर्द, तालुका तुळजापूर, जिल्हा उस्मानाबाद. मी स्वयं शिक्षण प्रयोगमध्ये एक लीडर महिला म्हणून काम करत आहे. लीडर महिला म्हणून काम करत असताना जी आपत्ती येते, आमच्याकडे जी 2012-13 मध्ये आपत्ती आली होती, ती एक दुष्काळाची आपत्ती होती. त्या आपत्तीसोबत कसं काय करावं हेच आम्हाला समजत नव्हतं. पण ज्यावेळेस आमच्या लक्षात आले की ही आपत्ती म्हणजे एक आपल्याला ही करून सोडणारी आहे आणि त्याच्यासोबत आपण काय करायचं हे ठरवलं. ज्यावेळेस आमच्याकडे पाणी नव्हतं, जनावरांसाठी चारा नव्हता आणि मनुष्यासाठी अन्नधान्यही नव्हतं आणि काय करावं हे सुचत नव्हतं, त्यावेळेस लक्षात आले की आपण ह्या आपत्तीबरोबर हताश न होता त्याला एक संधी म्हणून पुढे जायचं ठरवलं. आणि त्यावेळेस आम्ही आमच्या संघटन जी गटाच्या ह्याच्या माध्यमातून महिला शेतकऱ्यांनी विचार केला की जी आज आपल्या इकडं वातावरण बदलामुळे जे दुष्काळ पडला, ह्या दुष्काळाला आपल्याला सामोरे जायचे. मग त्यावेळेस असं ठरवलं की आपण जनावरांच्या चाऱ्याची सोय करायला पाहिजे. त्याच्यातून आम्ही एक आमच्या SSP कडून रेजिलिंग फंड मधनं आम्ही एक जनावरांच्या चाऱ्याची व्यवस्था केली. आता राहिला प्रश्न, जी जमीन जी बंजर झालेली होती, सुकी पडलेली होती, रासायनिक शेतीमुळे जी जमिनीमध्ये कुठलंही पीक येऊ शकत नव्हतं. पण त्यावेळेस एक आम्हाला एक संधी त्याच्यात दिसली दुष्काळामध्ये, की आमच्या जे परिसरामधले तलाव होते ते पूर्ण कोरडे पडलेले होते. त्या तलावातली माती जी आहे ती सुपीक होती आणि ती जमिनीसाठी एकदम उपयुक्त होती. जसं आपलं आरोग्य असतं तसं जमिनीचं पण आरोग्य असतं. हे आमच्या लक्षात आलं की आपण ही जी तलावातली माती आहे ती पूर्ण माती आपण शेतामध्ये टाकली पाहिजे. पण टाकायची कशी, की त्यावेळेस आम्हाला एक खूप म्हणजे दुष्काळ असल्यामुळे शेतकरी महिलांकडे पैसा नव्हता. पण हात पैसा नव्हता म्हणून बसण्यात पण काही अर्थ नव्हता. त्यावेळेस आम्ही एक आमच्या ग्रामपंचायत सोबत एक मीटिंग घेतली आणि त्या मीटिंगमध्ये असा निष्कर्ष करण्यात आला की जो लागणारा निधी आहे तो JCP आणि ट्रॅक्टरवाल्यासोबत करार केला की निम्मे पैसे आता आणि निम्मे नंतर. त्यावेळेस त्यांनी विचार केला की एवढे मोठा पैसा लागणार आहे त्याला आणि आपण हे कसं करायचं. मग त्यांनी काय केलं की ह्याला कोणतरी साक्षीदार पाहिजे म्हणून त्यांनी ग्रामपंचायत सोबत आम्हाला करार करायला लावला. मग शेतकरी महिलांना त्यावेळेस म्हणजे गावातले लोक विचारायचे की बाबा तुम्ही एवढं मोठं काम करायला आणि ह्या कामामध्ये तुम्हाला काय फायदा होणार आहे. पण आमच्या लक्षात आलं होतं की हा फायदा आमचा खरंच काळांना आम्हाला खूप चांगला फायदा आहे. त्याच्यामुळे आमची जमीन सुपीक होणार आहे आणि अशा दुष्काळात पण आम्हाला म्हणजे की आमची जमीन बंजर होणार नाही, काही ना काही त्याच्यात पिकणार आहे. आणि त्यावेळेस आम्ही पूर्ण सगळा गाळ काढला. प्रत्येक शेतकरी महिलांनी 30 ते 40 हजाराचा गाळ आपल्या शेतामध्ये टाकला आणि आमची जमीन सुपीक केली. त्यावेळेस आम्हाला जी येणारी संकट होती की जमीन रासायनिक शेती असल्यामुळे पिकत नव्हती. मग काय करायचं विचार करायचा आणि आम्ही करार तर केलेला होता की आता की निम्मे पैसे द्यायचं ठरलं होतं, निम्मे देऊन टाकले पैसे त्यांना, राहिले निम्मे पैसे. आणि आम्ही ते सुपीक माती गाळ टाकल्यामुळे आमची जमीन सुपीक झाली आणि आमचं जे येणारं पीक आहे ते खूप जोमदार आलं. आणि त्याच्यातच आम्ही एक नवीन चेंज केलं की वातावरणानुसार आपल्याला बदलायला हवंय. मग असं आमच्या ट्रेनिंगमध्ये लक्षात आलं की आमच्या वारंवार म्हणजे ट्रेनिंग होतात, त्या ट्रेनिंगमध्ये आम्हाला मार्गदर्शन केलं जातं आणि त्यातच आम्ही त्या दुष्काळच्या 12-13 सालमध्येच आम्ही सखी अन्न सुरक्षा एक शेती पद्धती अवलंब केली. त्या शेती पद्धतीमध्येच एक म्हणजे असं केलं की परस्परापरक पिकं त्याच्यात आम्ही ही केली की जेणेकरून एकाने जरी हाताबाहेर काढलं तर दुसरं साथ देईल आणि त्याच्यामुळे विषमुक्त अन्न ही आपल्या परिवाराला खायला मिळेल आणि जमिनीत पण त्याचं ही होईल. ह्याच्यासाठी आम्ही एक बदल केला. ती बदल असा होता की आम्हाला त्यावर्षी खूप चांगली कमाई झाली आणि त्याच्यातून आम्ही जे निघणारं जे अन्नधान्य आहे ती घरी खाऊन प्रत्येक म्हणजे मार्केटमध्ये पण आम्ही नेऊन विकू शकलो. जी भाजीपाला असेल, कडधान्य असेल घरी लागणारं ठेवून. पहिले पुरुष लोक काय करायचे की नगदी पिकाकडे वळलेली होती. त्याच्यामुळे त्यांनी काय करायचं की नगदी पिकं घेऊन जे येणारा पैसा आहे तो त्यांच्यापाशी ठेवायचा. पण आम्ही ज्यावेळेस ही महिला शेतकरी म्हणून एक निर्णय घेतला त्यावेळेस आमच्याकडे जे येणारे कडधान्य आहे ते घरी खाण्यासाठी
It seems like Shailaja's video has frozen. We will try to troubleshoot this with her on the back end. But perhaps in the meantime, Christina, if we would like to maybe wait a couple moments and after that, maybe move on to the following speaker.
Sure. Just to pick up on some of the themes that at least I heard from Shailaja's remarks, really the catalytic effect of that climate resilience fund that enabled the community to negotiate, to try new things, to experiment with new farming techniques, which is really quite a risky thing to do for a community. And interesting to hear about the scale that they were able to reach of 80,000 women sort of shifting their agricultural practices to more diversified farming, chemical-free, pesticide-free farming, more resilient practices over time. That's really quite impressive. Shall we see if we have Shailaja back? I should have mentioned in the introduction that that P is part of the Huayru's Commission network of organizations. And I know we have other folks from the Huayru Commission here on this session. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like she's back. Is that right?
I think she is slowly reconnecting now. So I think in a couple moments we will be able to reach her.
I will call her. I will call her.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, because we do want to hear the full breadth of what she had prepared. Perhaps the internet went out. That's a common occurrence.
Yes, I believe her internet had dropped off, and I think it may take a moment for us to re-reach her. So Christina, perhaps if we want to move on to the following speaker and circle back to Shailaja afterwards. Oh, I see that Shailaja is back.
Okay.
All good.
Oh, Shailaja's back. Okay, we'll continue on. Shailaja, thank you.
त्यावेळेस माझ्या घरच्यांनी माझ्या नावाने 2.5 एकर जमीन केली आणि ही एक म्हणजे का केली तर ह्याच्या मागचं कारण आहे की जे शासकीय योजना आहे ती महिलांसाठी आधी प्राधान्य असतं त्या विषयावर पण आम्ही काम भरपूर केलं माझ्या गावात 100 महिलांच्या नावाने शेती करण्यात आली ही सखी अन्न सुरक्षा मॉडेल जी केलेलं आहे ती ही पूर्णपणे आमच्या सेंद्रिय पद्धतीने केले त्याच्यामुळे ती प्रत्येक गोष्ट जी आहे ती
नेटवर्क इश्यूज देयर
आणि महिला होऊन आम्ही शासकीय अधिकाऱ्याकडे जाऊन सगळे प्रत्येक जी योजना असतील स्कीम असतील ती पूर्ण स्कीम महिलांपर्यंत पोहोचवण्याचं काम केलं आणि ते आज खरंच माझ्या
Shailaja, you are on mute. Unmute करके बात करो.
आता शोधाची आलेली लोक आहेत परदेशी लोक मुंबई पुणेची जी लोक आहेत त्यांना पण आम्ही काम देण्याचा हे केला जी मनरेगातून असेल किंवा कुठल्याही ह्याच्यातून योजनेमधून बसेल अशामध्ये त्यांना काम दिलं आणि ते काम दिल्यामुळे त्यांचं जी रोजीरोटी बंद होती ती पूर्णपणे चालू झाली हे एक आमच्यामध्ये एक प्रकारचं एक धाडस निर्माण झालं आणि आलेल्या आपत्तीबरोबर कुठलेही न हताश होता त्या परिस्थितीवर मात करून कसं पुढे जाता येईल ही एक आमच्यामध्ये एक ध्येय निर्माण झालं आणि आज आम्ही 5,000 महिलांसोबत रेझिलिंग फंड 3 कोटी वाटप केलेलं आहे ह्या फंडामुळे आमच्याकडे आर्थिक स्तर आमचा उंचवलेला आहे आणि त्याच्या एक महिलेपाशी एकापेक्षा 4 असल्यामुळे तिला कुठल्याही परिस्थितीत न हताश होता ती एक सक्षम झालेली आहे आरोग्यानेही सक्षम आहे आणि आर्थिक परिस्थितीनेही ती सक्षम झालेली आहे
Shailaja, आपको बोलना she is finished. Hello.
Hello, great, thank you very much. Bahut dhanyavad Shailaja. Thank you for those remarks and thank you to the translator for the closed captioning. So really interesting to hear some of the themes coming out of linking with policy, linking with the MREGA scheme for employment, but really just how impressive what this organized community could do with some catalytic funds and some additional support to really boost the resilience of the community in the face of drought and other shocks. From there, I'm going to go in the interest of time to our next speaker, Ms. Nanki Kar, who is the Regional Program Manager for the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD. Nanki, the floor is yours, and I understand you have a presentation for us.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Seems to be taking a moment to load, but I believe it should come shortly.
There we go.
All right. Thank you, Christina. And thank you, Shailaja, for that intervention. That was a great intervention. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy International Women's Day. Today, I'm going to build, I think, on what Shailaja has been saying, but focus specifically on micro, small, and medium enterprises in the mountains. I'm going to talk about why we need to focus on them and how policy and governance can strengthen the resilience of mountain enterprises. And just before starting, this is important when we're talking about policy and governance, because most of our countries are now focusing on their post-pandemic recovery packages. And there is a very large focus on the MSME sector. That's not necessarily a climate smart focus when we're talking about recovery. And when we're talking about climate policy, going up to COP26, again, there's in our countries, there's not an explicit focus on the resilience of MSMEs, which plays such an important role when we're talking about economic resilience. So just to put that up front, the reason why I'm focusing on this today. So to start off with, for those of you who are not familiar, I'm focusing specifically on the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, which we consider to be the pulse of the planet. This is a region that spans over 8 countries, all the way from Afghanistan to Bangladesh. It provides 4 global biodiversity hotspots, the largest reserves of ice outside the polar regions, source of 10 major Asian river systems, and as such, it supports almost 2 billion people, their livelihoods, and the economies of these countries. So it's a critical region if you're talking about a race to resilience or a race to zero. This is an important region of the world. So that's where I'm focusing on today. But this is also a region where we see the climate emergency unfolding very, very fast. So because of elevation-dependent warming, given that it's a mountain region, if you look at the current emission scenarios, we are likely to warm by 5.5 degrees in this area. And even a 1.5 degree world is too hot for us. So I'm saying that because, like I said, we have a large reserve of ice, and in a 1.5 degree world, we could be losing a significant amount of that, which then obviously will also result in climate-induced disasters across our region. So when we're coming specifically to the role of mountain enterprises, the first point I'd like to make out here is that this is a region that does support some niche enterprises. So for those of you who are into tourism, you can come and go to the top of the world if you're going for trekking to the Everest. For those of us who are coming out of COVID and are now more interested in what we eat, a lot of the superfoods come from our region. So it does support niche goods and services. And when we're talking about economic resilience, 95% of the private sector in our region is made up of MSMEs. So if you're talking about how do we invest in climate smart transition, this is a sector that will play a very important role. But because of the exposure, mountain value chains are vulnerable to climate and other shocks. And mountain entrepreneurs have little capacity to absorb or adapt or to transform their value proposition to these shocks. And that's due to the exposure or to the remoteness of this region. So that's a challenge that we do experience here. So this is something that we've been doing with our partners on the ground when we're talking about resilience. The first thing we've been trying to understand is what is it that we mean by resilience at an enterprise level. So if you look at the extreme right, what we are working with just now is we focus on the ability of the enterprise and its ability to absorb or adapt or transform its value proposition in response to climate shocks. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about economic value, that could focus on its ability to maintain or improve its productivity during a shock, and at the same time also create green jobs or reduce emission or sustain the ecosystem services that the enterprise relies on. If you look more on the left, we've been focusing again, what does it really take for an enterprise to make its value proposition resilient? So there we've been working with entrepreneurs and startups and focusing much more on their strategic orientation. So when they talk to break that up, that means your entrepreneurial orientation. Are you able to come up with innovative goods and services? And these are some of the attributes that enterprises that do have a more resilient outcome seem to have in common. So they have greater awareness of climate change or climate shocks when they're developing their goods and services. When we talk about market orientation, these are enterprises that know how to occupy a new and emerging green market. They are looking at how they can come up with green brands and are able to verify that branding. And they also have specific management capacity. These are enterprises that, for example, are able to invest in continuous learning to deal with uncertainty due to climate change. So these are some of the attributes that are emerging from the ground with the enterprises that we are working with. And my last slide is going to focus on how we can use policy and governance systems to really strengthen these types of attributes. And we've clustered them into 4 areas, all of which we think will play an important role if we are to support resilient mountain enterprises and help them to scale out across the region. So, like I said, is around enabling policy for production and consumption. So this is not a given. A lot of our policies are kind of blind when it comes to the MSME sector. So we really do need to think about cross-sector climate targets in our NDCs or the post-pandemic recovery packages. We've also looked at the climate standards and verification mechanisms across our region, and we don't have very much which is talking about green standards or resilient standards, and that plays a huge role. The second one is around infrastructure. This again is critical, and this is just an example. It's infrastructure for access to services. If we are talking about green or resilient enterprises, a large part will also come with access to clean energy, which again, in our region, there is a big focus on clean energy, but the productive end use of that energy, specifically by the MSME sector, is lacking. So that's an example of how policies can strengthen infrastructure. Again, one that I think a lot of us will be working with is infrastructure in terms of platforms that will promote learning or sharing between enterprise and the finance sector, or innovation, or mechanisms to help aggregate resilient goods and services will play a very important role as we move forward. The other areas around strengthened capabilities, and we've pulled out green skills, since a lot of our countries are focusing on this. But again, a need to focus on skills in the MSME sector, a sector which is not in the informal sector. That again is lacking. So that's something where policy and governance can play a big role. And the last one, like Shailaja said, is a lot about access to finance and how we can have targeted financial instruments like the fund that she mentioned, but also principles for responsible investment, which are emerging, but again, they don't target the mountains or the MSME sector within it. So these are some of the examples of policies and governance mechanisms that we can use as we move forward. And Christina, with that, I'm ending with the call to protect the pulse. That's the mountain system, MSMEs within it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanki. A great presentation, really setting the scene for the interrelationships that we need between infrastructure, policies, financial instrument, financing, and capacity, crucially. So I think you hit on everything that we want to speak to today, really grounding it in the Hindu Kush region, in the pulse of the planet, as you said. We're going to go deeper a little bit now with our next speaker, Mr. Stefan Kohler, from UN Country Manager for UN Ops in Bangladesh, to discuss a little bit more of those infrastructure issues that matter, that underlying infrastructure and where it needs to be. And Nanki, thank you for making the case that when you're talking about the private sector in this part of the world, it's most often 90% or thereabouts MSMEs. So important to keep that in mind. Stefan, over to you. And just for the participants, we will have time for questions and answers. So be thinking of questions that you want to dive into further. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christina, and good morning. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Let's just jump into the presentation. As Christina said, we're going to talk a little bit more about infrastructure and the resilience of infrastructure and how that actually supports economic sector resilience. And the work I'll be talking about is some of the work we've been doing in Bangladesh. But before we get to the actual project we've been working on, just a couple of kind of, I suppose, concepts that I think are important for us to understand so that we're all talking about the same thing, that we're all coming at it from the same perspective. We heard the previous speaker talk about infrastructure, and I think we all kind of understand the word infrastructure, but really if we think about it, what does it actually mean? What is infrastructure? And the way we look at this is it's a key enabler for development, and it does that by facilitating the flows of goods and services. And this is what allows societies and communities to function effectively, to grow and to flourish. And typically we think of economic activity in terms of services that are required for an economy to function. And the 5 kind of key services are transport, ICT, water, wastewater, solid waste, and energy. And when you distill it down, in essence, all economic activity is in some way underpinned by these services that are all enabled by infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure resilience, it's key to ensure that our economic activities are not disrupted by shocks and stresses, and to ensure what we call continuity of services, so that the services are not disrupted. That means the delivery of the services by the assets is not disrupted. All the disruption is actually minimized, and we can restore service as quickly as possible when the infrastructure is subject to hazards or shocks and stresses that interact with the infrastructure. So in short, our infrastructure assets need to be resilient. But the key question is, how do we achieve resilience of our infrastructure assets? And the way we look at this is that we look at infrastructure as a system, and it's made up of 3 components, which is the institution, generally the organization that's responsible for the management of those infrastructure assets, the knowledge that sits within the system about those assets. This is often interpreted purely as data, but it's much broader than that. It covers things like your building codes, your standards, it covers research, all the knowledge that sits around the infrastructure assets. And then lastly, we have the assets themselves, which is the things that we generally see, the roads or the bridges or the buildings. Together, the institution and the knowledge create what we call the capacity in the infrastructure system. What is the function of the capacity in the system? So the capacity, the knowledge and institutions is what is responsible for the planning, the design, the creation, the operations and maintenance, and the disposal of those assets. And the whole function of the assets is to generate value for the institution or for the country or for the region. And that value is actually the delivery of services, which are essential for the economic activity. So what you can see here is that it's not really about the assets themselves, but it's about the capacity in the system, which is actually all about the governance and how those assets are managed across their whole life cycle, from planning, design, through to disposal. And that's quite a key concept, because we always think of the physical things we see, but we often don't focus on the governance that sits around those assets. So the work we're doing in Bangladesh is with the local government engineering department, which is a department under the Ministry of Local Government, Rural Development and Cooperatives, and is largely responsible for the planning, development, maintaining and managing of all the local level infrastructure across the country. And LGD recognizes that it's essential to manage those assets sustainably and effectively to deliver the appropriate levels of service to the community that meets their needs, expectations, and obviously for present and future generations. Now, all of these local infrastructure assets underpin kind of economic activities that happen across rural Bangladesh. So UNOPS is working with UNDP, and we're working together with UN Women and the government increase the resilience resilience to disasters and reduction in the impacts of shocks and stresses that occur on those assets, and hence protects lives. It supports livelihoods and production of health of persons, and supports businesses and communities in Bangladesh. So the outcome we're trying to achieve, and the objective, is this improved capacity to achieve resilience through designing and constructing what is called risk-informed and disability-inclusive and gender-responsive infrastructure systems. And the way that that's happening is we are working with LGD to develop what we call an asset management system. Now, when we started this piece of work, there was a kind of preconceived notion that asset management is software or a database and is limited to maintenance of the assets. There was also an expectation from LGD that an asset management system would be something physical. But what LGD have very quickly realized is that asset management is nothing physical. It's about the way they do their business and about the way they improve procurement procedures, processes, and systems in bringing about a cultural change within the organization around the way they manage their assets, i.e. what we're striving for is really good governance. And I think the best way to sum this up is from a quote from Rohini Nilekani, who says, "We cannot be mere consumers of good governance. We have to be participants, and we must be co-creators." And this is what the National Resilience Program is doing in Bangladesh, is being a co-creator of good governance that or kind of surrounds the infrastructure assets. And in some of those photographs, you can see that the assets we're talking about are not incredibly sophisticated, large-scale structures. But where you have a small culvert that's damaged by a flood, and it actually breaks the connectivity between a community and a health system, or between a farmer and a market, it has major consequences. So it's not only the scale and the size of the asset that's important, but it's the impact, the relevance it has to the services it's delivering and the economic impact it can have. And we see the answer to this lies in good governance, how we actually manage those assets effectively. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Stefan, for making the governance aspects visible within the infrastructure sector. Too often, you're right, we focus on the bridges or the financial losses, but it's really about going upstream and understanding the institutions' capacities that govern that infrastructure. And as you said, understanding the impact of that infrastructure. A bridge washed out might wop out the discretionary budget for a year of a local government, and mean that those investments aren't going to education, to other sectors and services that are needed. We're going to move on next to Neha Rai, who is the Climate Finance and M&E Specialist at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. We've touched on the issue of food system fragility many times already in this session, and so we'll be hearing a little bit more about agriculture and the land use sector, and how we can bring a governance perspective into that sector for greater economic resilience. So Neha, the floor is yours. Oh, Neha, do we have you? Do we have you there? I know. Yep, we can hear you. Great.
That was no problem.
That was you.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Now we can hear you. Great.
I'm having trouble with my internet today because it usually doesn't rain so much in Italy, but today for some reason it's torrential. But I'm trying to get my internet fixed. Hold on.
You're just making the point about infrastructure and our reliance on it for economic activity.
Yes, I'm going to start my video. Hold on.
And we can see your presentation now.
Okay, in my presentation, I will focus on agriculture as a primary economic sector, which is both a contributor to emissions, but also hugely affected by climate change, particularly in Asia. And I think it's difficult to beat the presentations of Shelja and Nanki, who has already talked about the local context. But I'll try to take you through how climate finance or climate governance in the agriculture is crucial from a multilateral perspective, as you see this now, looking at agriculture as an economic sector. Now, before I go into the details on how climate governance is happening in the agriculture sector, I think it's important to understand a few things around why food and agriculture industry is a significant component of the global economy. In many least developed economies, agriculture can account for more than 25% of GDP. In fact, in Asian agriculture alone, it's responsible for 2/3 of global agriculture GDP. When it comes to employment, we know 60% of poor working adults make a living through their agriculture, particularly in low-income economies. And given that it's the Women Day, we need to realize that more than 60% of women are employed in the agriculture sector. So agriculture growth is important to end extreme poverty and hunger and ensure there's inclusivity when we're talking about vulnerable populations. But at the same time, we also know that climate change is derailing agriculture-driven growth, particularly when it comes to poverty reduction and food security. And a lot of you have mentioned that in your presentations. Looking at warming alone in Asia, a 3-degree warming could reduce net revenues by 28% in Asia, which is around almost 200 billion per year. So global climate change could threaten the livelihoods of nearly billions of people dependent on it. And I think it's important to set that context when we're talking about climate adaptation and governance, which is crucial to safeguard socioeconomic well-being. Now, when we talk about climate finance and climate governance in the agriculture sector, several efforts are being taken both globally as well as domestically, where countries are investing in climate action in the agriculture and land use sector. If you look at the NDCs, which are the national climate plans, which are currently being enhanced, agriculture is a major priority in more than 90% of countries' first cycle of NDCs. Coronovia Joint Work Program has put agriculture at the heart of the international climate agenda. In the planning space, agriculture is a pivotal part of the national adaptation plans. As a result, FAO developed specific supplementary guidelines on addressing agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, and NAPs, which provide sector-specific guidance. So when we look at the global level, there's lots going on, but at the national level as well, now all of these plans and policies are being transitioned into integration into national planning and budgeting processes through programs like NAP-AG, which is now in its sunset period where it's culminating. But NAP-AG support, which is a UNDP FAO program, had some instrumental effects in terms of the planning for agriculture international processes. For example, in Uganda, NAP-AG really helped the country in developing a national adaptation plan for agriculture. Countries like Thailand and Philippines improved their agriculture sector plans to mainstream climate change and into their national planning processes. And also then Guatemala invested in national MSME systems for agriculture. And finally, countries like Kenya and Nepal invested in improving public expenditure analysis for climate change. In fact, I would like to mention that we have a hot off the press report, which was published this month on public expenditure in the agriculture sector of Kenya, which provides ways to calculate spending in agriculture related to climate change, which could help countries like Kenya really make robust decisions to invest in climate smart agriculture. So I would really recommend you to have a look at it. So these are some of the things which are being done on the ground for climate governance in the agriculture sector. But despite of several efforts being taken, there are several barriers to operationalize plans and lead them into implementation phase. And one of the major barriers is lack of systems-wide thinking. For example, NDC priorities in agriculture sector tend to look at food production, but not at solutions across the whole food systems, like socioeconomic systems or the climate systems, which is a major barrier to implementation of NDCs. The other barriers are around insufficient cross-sectoral planning and limited use of long-term climate information to identify transformative climate actions. In addition, insufficient investments and financing is another barrier which stems from limited engagement of other actors like private sector in NDC NAP implementation, which is a crucial player in delivering long-term climate action in agriculture sector. So achieving climate-related goals in land use agriculture will require more engagement of other actors like private sector actors in making sure we are able to move ahead, as we saw in the presentations of Nanki and Shailaja as well previously. Now, responding to some of these barriers, FAO and UNDP is delivering the SCALA program, which is addressing some of these challenges. And SCALA, which is a sequel to NAP-AG, is a program that focuses on scaling ambition on land use and agriculture through NDCs and NAPs. The program is a German Environment Ministry funded project, IKI-funded project that aims to use a systems-wide approach to NDCs and NAP processes. It moves beyond long-term old climate action planning to accelerate NDC implementation. The program will be operational in 12 countries with a budget of 20 million spread over 5 years, with an objective to support countries to translate their NDCs into actionable and transformative climate actions in agriculture and land use. It's a joint effort between UNDP and FAO, addressing some of the challenges that I already mentioned in my earlier slides. One of the things which I would like to focus on here is, which is also a main component of SCALA, is to meet NDC NAP commitments by joining hands with the private sector, like agribusinesses and small and medium enterprises. And the intention is to develop some concrete ways in which SCALA will bring the public and private sector together in NDC NAP discussions in identifying climate priorities, so that companies can contribute in NDC NAP processes and also identify priorities where they are able to engage more fruitfully in transformative climate action. In addition, SCALA would really help countries and private companies within those countries identify business opportunities around climate solutions in agriculture sector. The program will really help assess risks and barriers and design de-risking instruments that can help the private sector invest in climate action And eventually, as a result of these interventions, it will enable businesses to play a crucial role in investing in climate action, for example, through climate resilient crop varieties or climate compatible agriculture extension services, or by helping companies make their own supply chains more climate positive, or by helping to use data and technology for climate information systems. And finally, by mobilizing investments in climate action and financing. In sum, I think we have limited time, but I would like to conclude here. When we're talking about climate governance in the agriculture sector, it's crucial to take a more multi-sector, whole of the society and systems-wide approach, the crucial role for domestic private sector, as already mentioned by our colleagues here, to address some of the challenges in operationalizing climate policies and plans in the agriculture sector. And I'll leave it here in interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neha. Thanks for bringing those points out and really introducing a systems thinking framework for us to use. In the interest of time, I'm going to go straight to questions, and some of you have been putting questions in the Q&A box, which is great. We have a question from Jennifer, which is targeted towards Nunki, but I think several of the panelists might want to chime in on this. We heard about the power that finance, catalytic finance, can have from Shailaja. But so often it doesn't reach the informal sector. It doesn't reach those that aren't officially part of the system. And so how can we advocate with national governments to ensure that these groups have access to climate finance at the local level? Nunki, I don't know if you want to come in on that one, but others are welcome to chime in on that as well. And please do keep putting your questions in the Q&A chat. We only have a few minutes right now, but we can have people answer them offline if we don't get to it.
Thanks, Christina. I answered that in the live chat as well. But again, just to reiterate, I think Shailaja's example was a great one of how you can set up resilience funds at the community level, which really do improve access to finance. In addition, we have from our member countries, Nepal and Bangladesh, which have used their public finance management system to deliver finance at the local level. So Nepal has got their local adaptation planning framework, which channels finance to the local level, and Bangladesh also uses its fiscal framework to channel finance for investments in local adaptation. So those are examples of what governments are doing. And we've just started looking at, given that a lot of MSMEs function in the informal sector, we're going to start looking at how things like fintech or financial technology can really improve access to financial services. And Jennifer, that's something new we are starting, so I shall send links as soon as possible. Thank you. And I'll send on the ICIMOD program, I'll put that into the chat as well. Thank you.
Great. And I would say, please do add in links into the chat function. For instance, Neha, you mentioned a recent publication for Kenya, so please do drop that in the chat box when you have a moment. Are there other questions that anyone wants to ask at this point?
There seemed to be one more question in the Q&A panel from Karan, and it is, if you should be able to view it as well. I think Christina in the Q&A panel, feel free to field it.
Yeah, I think Nunki said she'd answer that in the chat about plans to access climate finance for MSMEs.
Well noted.
So we'll let you do that in the chat. All right, without further ado, then we will move into our next panel, which has two speakers to really reflect on what we've heard in the first panel, the themes of infrastructure, the themes of entrepreneurship, engaging the private sector, and really going from the grassroots up. But thinking more specifically about scale, and this will mean different things to different people, different segments of society. But we want to focus specifically on how things can scale to create that systemic economic resilience impact that we're all looking for. So our first panelist is Aslam Pervez, the Deputy Executive Director of the Asia Disaster Preparedness Center. Aslam, I understand ADPC has been involved in SME resilience for nearly 10 years now, since the 2011 floods hit Thailand. It would be interesting to see and hear about the progress that has happened since then. What changes you think are still needed in policy and governance to really help scale up SME resilience work further. So Aslam, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it is a privilege to be in this meeting, and also to all the panelists and participants and the people outside. Happy International Women's Day. Asian Disaster Preparedness Center started working on the subject of resilient business, resilient economy, and resilient SME immediately after the 2011 floods and the great Eastern Japan earthquake and tsunami that we had. We actually embarked on this journey after the APEC meeting, where there was a lot of emphasis on making SMEs prepare for future disaster, and this is how it is started. From 2011 to 2015, we have been very actively engaged at the APEC, which is the Asia Pacific Economic Community platform. And at the various APEC meetings, particularly through the Emergency Preparedness Working Group and the Transport Sector Working Group, we have been able to put through this whole issue of disaster preparedness in SMEs. But by the time we also realize in Thailand that it is not only helping them to prepare, but at the same time, we really have to look at how the business continue, how the supply chain continues. So around 2015, and I'm very happy that both ADB and some of my colleagues who were the architect of that program and the German government through the GIZ, we actually developed a program. And again, at that time, 2015 and let's say 2018, the focus was that how you actually touch on the issue of SME resilience or business resilience rather than only talking about disaster preparedness. Today, when I'm speaking to you, and let me just say that we really have progressed well through this facility that ADPC created way back in 2015, we call I Prepare Business. We, of course, started with 6 countries and looking at some of the initial work of SMEs and providing the ministry related to SME to help them understand and incorporate disaster preparedness. But right now, when I'm speaking to you, we have a much larger program. We call it Asia Preparedness Partnership. And one of the strong component of Asia Preparedness Partnership is a vision where government, non-government, and private sector forms and decide national priorities with local action. So from a very specific project converting into a program with much scaled up attitude, we really touch based on 4 key issues: regulations, capacity development, incentives, and awareness generation. I'm quite confident by saying that in terms of SMEs building their resilience, capacity development and awareness generation, there's a number of programs, number of things has happened, and primarily from looking at disaster and climate resilience. However, the work related to regulations and incentive, and this is what I wanted to highlight today, that what still needs to be done is important. First of all, why private sector or MSME would adopt climate resilient strategies or invest in climate resilience. I mean, they really need incentives. Now, for them to include climate information and risk analysis need to be made available to them so that they can make better investment decision. In terms of the issue of government policies enabling adaptation investment, I just highlight to you is that perhaps there is a very specific reference in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which is primarily from a DRR perspective, that how we should engage businesses in the disaster risk reduction strategies at the national and local level. 2020 was the year where the countries were supposed to report on the achievement of DRR strategies. We analyzed it, we found last year, I mean, from a COVID angle, that there is absolutely very few things mentioned that, how in those DRR strategies, some of these government policies can actually help. Nonetheless, there are policy guidance, but which has not reached and not fully understood by the SMEs. The final point for me, just to conclude, is about the financial instrument. Besides working all that one, a lack of available financing options is the biggest barrier. And I think our colleague from GIZ, and particularly the work that has been doing in Philippines, this is what all the time has been coming out, that for them to invest in adaptation, they really need a lot of financing options, which is more low-risk financial instrument, so that they can quickly adopt. Because we are talking about these 99% of the sector, which is the backbone, but at the same time, they are not the most richest one. So I think this is where I would just end. These are the 3 points where I think further work needs to be done. And ADPC, through its Asia Preparedness Program and the I Prepare Business Facility, we are ready to take this further up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aslam. That's great, and makes a good segue to our next speaker, Andreas Hassmann, who is the project manager for tourism for sustainable development at GIZ in Germany. Andreas, thank you for waking up early to join us. From what I understand, and we've heard about tourism already from the opening remarks. From the Director of Climate Change of the Maldives, hearing about the impact of COVID on the tourism sector and therefore the economy of the Maldives. You've been working specifically on tourism, and I'd love to hear how this work has evolved within GIZ, and how you bring governance-related lessons into that work, into your tourism resilience work, and just to hear a little bit more about that, if you don't mind.
My pleasure. Tourism originally at GIZ has been more like a niche topic that has been used as an instrument to reach mostly the SDGs, so not so much the Paris Climate Accord. That's a new thing that started to happen. And it has been very dispersed, like the tourism industry is overall. Tourism is 10% of global GDP, and tourism is everywhere and often in climate risk places, these destinations. We used to have like 60 projects using tourism for biodiversity protection to employment generation. But what COVID changed now, the current pandemic, which is just one disaster among many tourism is affected by regularly, is that we started to think more systematically about also how to include risk-informed development and also resilience. That hasn't really been a topic because it was all about just mitigating over-tourism and working against the the bad effects of tourism on the one hand side and using the positive effects of tourism. But now we realize it's actually a model where we need a more systems approach to it. We need to think about how can we strengthen the tourism companies and how can we engage better with private sector. Specifically, our group is working with engagement on the private sector, and we started to bring together disaster risk management thinking and cooperation with the private sector at GIZ at the moment. And that's something that sounds, I think, quite normal to the people in this panel, but something that actually never really happened before in tourism and development. So it's quite some interesting developments we can see. Personally, I find delivery systems actually the most important part we should be working at the moment. And I saw in the presentations from FAO, but also from the mountain tourism, that knowledge is a key instrument. So we strengthen currently our digital education delivery systems with a learning management system that's available globally, where we always also include thoughts on resilience, but want to offer digital content for MSMEs, if you like, for line staff or normal people, not policymakers and the higher ups, but really also on the SMEs grassroots level, approachable and low obstacle knowledge to be provided. And yeah, that's the kind of things we're currently doing at GIZ.
Thank you, Andreas. We have a little bit of time for question, and Drupad, I see you have a question on scaling. If you want to pop that question into the chat box, either Q&A box. Oh, there you go. That was quick. Let's start with that question, and I'll invite Andreas and Aslam first to take a stab at this, but then I have a question for all panelists. So Drupad's question is, if resilience building enhances risk management and risk aversion capacities, it will result in reducing loss and increasing financial returns, making sound financial sense. So if resilience building safeguards or increases returns, why offer incentives? In a way that's asking, why isn't this happening anyway, if investing in resilience reduces risks and losses over the long term? So I don't know, Andreas or Aslam, do you want to address the issue of incentives?
I think
subsidies.
Yes, subsidies we don't use actually, but we realize with a lot of these smaller tourism industry partners, and it's not the big ones like Accor or Marriott, but really local properties, local hotels, it's not so much about the incentives, it's that they don't know that sustainability pays or investing in resilient pays off. So it's more often that providing better information would kickstart the conversation with these actors. They often do not have the large departments and knowledge in the heads of managers who work from season to season, and they don't think in decades like these risk happens. They think from one commercial season to the next. So these investment decisions that take maybe 10 years or 5 years to amortize, it's just not on their way of thinking. It's a different ontology, different way of thinking, if you like, and that's where we go in, providing these knowledge to change the way of thinking. And scaling means it's actually the key issue since it's so decentralized. So we also have to think more about how to reach people everywhere and people that are time poor because they're so busy with running their businesses.
Right, so a big challenge in terms of mindset shifts that need to occur, thinking longer term, and then scaling through a decentralized kind of more bottom-up approach. Aslam, I don't know if you want to come in on this question.
I think just to add, I fully agree that they are not aware, but I mean, one of the challenges that we face, because we are talking about MSMEs and SMEs, I mean, you can imagine the definition, you know, from for a person in a company to even 500, 600, but let's talk about those who have less capacity. There are conflicting government regulations and things for insurance and how to actually they can access some of the government benefits. That information is not readily available. I just give an example. 10 years ago, things has really changed, improved, and we are in a much better situation, but it still persists. 2011, when the government, announced a 30 million baht, recovery program for the SMEs. And as per the Bank of Thailand, 5 years from 2011, not even 30% of that particular amount was being used. The problem was that when the SMEs go to the bank, first of all, either they are registered or not registered. So there are conflicting government rules and regulations, which really makes it as a barrier for them to avail the incentives or to know about the incentive. Thank you.
Thanks, Islam. I wanted to open up to our other panelists who are still here with us. The title of this session is about linking form and function, and too often we focus mainly on the forms, the policies, the regulations, and the things that are maybe easier to count on our program log frames. How do we actually kind of shift the focus into more of the implementation aspects of this? And Neha, you touched on this in your presentation a bit. How do we deal with the informal, the institutional issues, those thornier governance issues that really affect the decisions that are made at the end of the day? And I want to give all panelists a chance to chime in on this. How do we ensure that we're hitting the functions and not just the forms? Does anyone want to start on that?
Maybe me, if I can chip in again.
Go ahead, Andreas.
Since I think I come from a more operational side of development cooperation, like in our case, we have a lot of projects that use these multi-actor partnerships where we really try to get together government partners and industry partners and just convene them to make them talk, but then also to provide the measures that after the talk comes the walk for especially private sector, that they can implement things, and also to help governments to have this conversation, but private sector would need to be more effective in their implementation. That's anything from infrastructure to education needs. And I think these conversations, if they're practical and understand how business can be included, how they can get a return of investment, what kind of access to finance they would need and under what conditions, then this form follows function, follows implementation, and can work or does work in many places already.
Thank you, Andreas. Anyone else want to come in on that, a different perspective or an addition?
Christina, perhaps I could just share with you the experience we had in Bangladesh. I think, as I said in my presentation, I think working with LGD, there was a perception that there would be something kind of tangible, a document or a product. But in effect, as I noted, what it was about was, it's about changing the way we do business, which is actually a cultural shift. And that's quite difficult to achieve. And what we had to do there was actually obviously engage with the senior leadership in the organization to embrace this, to say, okay, we really want to do something different that will translate into different outcomes on the ground. And then obviously there was a process of training, engaging, of knowledge sharing with other organizations who've done this. So it was actually a kind of whole cultural shift. And this term change the business, it's not just business as usual, is required. And I think that's been one of the key components of this. And then working at multiple levels within the organization. It's not just the leadership, but it's also those that are working on the ground at sort of project level. So it translates vertically as well as horizontally through the organization. It's a slow process. This is a sort of a 2-year program. It doesn't happen overnight. And I think we kind of also have to shift a little bit our time scales of thinking, because I think in the development world, we're so used to thinking of 1 or 2 year projects and programs and outputs and, as you said, log frames. How do you do a change management of an organization in a log frame? That's quite a challenge. How we present.
Yes,
but
indeed.
Yeah, just some thinking on what we've been doing.
Great. We're going to go to a poll in just a minute to get people's perspectives from the audience on what needs to change. But I think we've hit on a couple of different themes here in terms of if we really want to build economic resilience to climate change, there's some big shifts that need to happen in terms of policy, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of financing. But undergirding all of that are really the incentives, the mindsets that need to change, the capacities that need to change. And as has been mentioned, it needs to happen at multiple levels and across multiple sectors. It can't just be in one part of the economy, because they're all quite interconnected. And so this is really a thorny issue that's really about values. And it's a slow process to engage in that change and that shift. But we have some important entry points to do so, with the investments going into economic recovery plans, with the investments and thinking going into climate change resilience plans and NDCs as well. And so there's multiple opportunities. It just takes quite a dedicated focus to achieve that, as everyone on this panel in this session I'm sure knows well and has been very passionately working towards. So in just the few minutes that we have left, we want to quickly do a poll to get your perspectives on what should be the priority for strengthening policy and governance for economic sector resilience. There's a couple different options there. We're not giving you the option to write your own answer. We really want to force you to choose one of those, just to see the relative balance. So take a second to click your answer there. What do you think is most important? And if you could bring up the results, I think it would be interesting to see.
Yes, for sure. I see from my end that a couple people are still responding, so I think maybe in around.
Give you a second.
Yep.
And panelists, I'm going to return to you for your quick 30 seconds or less kind of Twitter length recommendations from this session on how we can increase and improve policy and governance for economic resilience. So be giving that some thought.
Okay, I think I will end the poll now and share results.
Great. Let's see what others think is most important. So our winner is promoting inclusive, risk-informed decision-making at all levels, but close next to that is improved capacity for understanding climate risk at systemic levels to promote resilient economic development. Interesting. And a little bit less on improved coordination. Interesting. Great. Thank you, everyone who voted for sharing your thoughts. So now I'm going to call on panelists, so I apologize for doing this, but Nanki, can I turn to you to get your 30-second recommendations? Oh, Nanki, do we have you there? All right, maybe we'll return. Nanki, go ahead.
Christina, could I come next, please? I lost you for a minute.
Okay. Yes, we'll give you another shot. I guess next on my list is Aslam. Why don't you go next? Or okay, first, so actually.
Besides, my recommendation would be making climate information and risk analysis system relevant to businesses to guide their investment decisions under changing climate conditions.
Great, very succinct. Second? Nope, you only get one. That's very clear and very sharp. We'll go with that. So making climate risks relevant to businesses so they know what actions to take. Neha, I see your video on, so I'm going to turn to you next. Neha, do you want to come off mute? Great. We can hear you.
Yes, I think one of the points which someone in the audience mentioned around, you know, why should we give incentive to the private sector when they already have an incentive to invest in climate resilient action? I would like to touch upon that point when it comes to agriculture sector resilience actions. And I think one thing that needs to be mentioned quite clearly is that the private sector is currently quite nascent in their understanding of how they can contribute in NDC-NAP planning processes and also in climate resilient action. So even though it seems like there is an incentive or there is clear opportunity for them to invest in these kind of actions, they're still quite averse to doing that, largely because they see a lot of risk in it. So when we're talking about investable actions, it's not very clear for them how they can see business opportunities in agribusiness related actions and engage with the government sector. So even though there are clearly opportunities for them, they still need an initial incubation space where they can come together, identify opportunities, see a real reason to invest, which is profitable, as well as improving their reputation in investing in climate action. So I think that's where there's a coordinated initiative needed between the government and the multilaterals and the local actors like Shailaja and the small scale farm holders, as well as the private sector, to come together as a whole of society, as a systems-wide approach to bring together the initiative, not only to bring profits, but also to enable more engagement for a larger shared vision in agriculture climate action.
Thanks.
And I think that's where I would leave it.
Yeah, thanks, Neha. We just need we need to wrap up in the next few seconds here. So I want to turn to Nanki very briefly. What's your takeaway, your recommendation?
Thanks, Christina. I'm ready now. I'll go back to your first one, or what this session is on function before form. And if you're talking about economic resilience and the issue of scale, I think it really boils down to more resilient consumption and production patterns. And at the moment, I think we are still, for Drupal's question, still very much business as usual world, where our production and consumption is quite resource intensive or more focused on the brown economy. And in order to shift to a more resilient production and consumption, I think the forms that we are looking at is probably a much stronger awareness raising on why we should be more, why there should be more resilient production and consumption. Your policy framework to disinvest from the brown economy and shift towards a more green or resilient economy, and also financing, how we structure our finance and make sure that it is going into more resilient flows rather than a brown economy. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Nanki. Stefan, you're next. And I just want to brief people at Shailaja. I'm going to go to you next for a final word. Stefan, go ahead.
Thanks, Christina. Christina, yes, I think the question that, or the comment in the Q&A, I think, you know, risk and resilience are completely interlinked. And I think it's really important, though, for us to adopt longer term horizons, because the activities we do now are going to kind of manifest over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And I think it's trying to understand what are the climatic shocks and stresses we're going to be dealing with in that period of time, and how are they going to impact on the activities. And I think I agree that it's not about, I don't think it's a case of do we need incentives to invest in this. I think it's why are we not doing this? I think the sort of argument for incentives is gone. I think the incentive is there in itself. If we don't do it, we're in trouble. That's the reality. And thinking 30, 40, 50 years ahead, what will the world look like? And I think that presents us with a big challenge in terms of the governance and how do we manage those risks that far out.
Great, thank you. Shailaja, I want to hear from you next. Any brief final thoughts?
हे जे शक्य झाले आहे ते पूर्ण ही संघटन असल्यामुळे आमचं शक्य झालं आहे. हे संघटनाचंच एक उदाहरण आहे. आणि आता इथूनही पुढे जे शासन आणि जे स्वयंसेवी संस्था आहेत ह्या संस्थेनेही अशा आमच्यासारख्या लीडर महिला प्रत्येक ह्याच्यामध्ये आर्थिक असो किंवा ट्रेनिंगच्या ह्याच्यामध्ये असो त्यांना ईमेल करून गाव पातळीवर जी काय हे असलेल्या योजना असलेल्या त्या लीडर महिलांपर्यंत ही करून एक त्यांना एक आर्थिक सहाय्यता करून त्यांना सक्षम करावं हा एवढा माझा संदेश आहे.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for the rapid transcription. An important message today on International Women's Day, but every day as well. I'm next going to go to Andreas, if you want to give us a quick final word, and after that to Mr. Wahid.
Yes, my final word would be only with risk-informed development can we ensure sustainable development in all its facets, and that's everybody's business. Full stop.
Oh, perfect Twitter-length message for us today. Thank you. It is everyone's business. Ahmed?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll be very brief. I think it's important to mainstream the economic vulnerabilities mainly into all sectors. Often it's not that, people are not aware of the benefits and also the opportunities that we will gain while investing on economic, reducing the economic vulnerabilities. So I think it's important to mainstream economic vulnerabilities in all sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a great note to end on, and thank you for the government of Maldives for organizing this session today. We're over time, so I'm going to wrap up very quickly, but I do want to say thank you to all our panelists for your insights. It was great to have such a breadth of different perspectives to really bring out the themes of how we need to invest more in changing those mindsets, but make it practical, do it at scale, and involve really a whole of society and really integrate the system thinking into every sector, every level of government, if we're truly going to be resilient to shocks and stresses due to climate change and as was discussed, many others that we're facing as well. I want to thank the participants for engaging today, for all the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions in the chat box. Hopefully the Q&A session will stay open a little bit longer so panelists can reply to those. And with that, I will say thank you to our hosts for making this session happen today, and wish you a happy International Women's Day and rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you so much, Christina. Just going to deliver a few closing remarks here. Thank you once again for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Thank you, Christina, once again, and all the wonderful panelists for a really insightful session. Please feel free to join us for the upcoming sessions, which are highlights of Day 1 and a special International Women's Day artistic commemoration event hosted by the Embassy of Italy to the Kingdom of Thailand. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum conference community on Hubilo. Within that conference community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees if you would be interested in doing so. And last but not least, you can join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN2020. Thank you once again, everyone, for your participation, and see you in the next sessions. Have a great rest of your day.